This conference will now be recorded.
All right. So the last class on Friday, we were discussing about variables and how do you declare the variables, and moreover, we are declaring something around infrastructure as a code. So anyone, any questions in there before I move to the next topic? Anyone, any questions there? Anyone, any questions that I can take here?
Kiran,
Good, please.
Kiran, variables we have seen like variable installation and assigning the values to the variables
Mm-hmm.
for running the pipeline
Mm-hmm.
CI/CD. Do we have? Can we dynamically give the variable names instead of we have in the last class we have seen that we are providing the values over there.
Mm-hmm.
The runtime can be dynamically give the variables by using the ARM template, such kind of scripting.
When you say during the runtime, do you want to produce the variables over the runtime and then assign?
Yeah.
Yes, you can do that. You can go ahead and let's say do runtime variables as well. There is something called set.vso task variable or something like that. Let's say set Azure DevOps variables, Azure DevOps variables partially. And if you want to run this on let's say something on let's say a runtime out here, you could do that. You could go ahead and do this as a secret, or let's see the basic one. So you can use this particular let's say snippet which says VSO task set variable and the name of the variable and the value of the variable out here. So it's telling the name of the variable is my var and the value of the variable is foo. So it's just telling that you can go ahead and do that. So yes, you can do that. You can set the variables over a runtime. There's a provision in Azure DevOps to do that. Yes,
Mhm. It is showing in YAML. So PowerShell, YAML, ARM,
it is
anything.
showing in it's giving you an example in YAML. You can do the same thing in Classic. You can just put a partial inside a Classic and you can do that. Shouldn't be a problem at all. So it's the same logic out there. I can give a demo on that. We can also show you how do you really set that out. I'll
Oh,
just note it down and I can. I mean, basically, when you say that you need some variables out here to set up dynamically, right? Firstly, you need to define what is your input. My input can be a JSON file, right? So I can go ahead and let's say declare all my variables in a JSON. I can let my PowerShell read all my variables from a JSON and set it dynamically out here. So I can do that. So I can do that and set all these variables on a runtime memory out here as such.
and also Kiran, after after completing the end-to-end pipeline, like
Okay.
starting from code repository,
Mm-hmm.
code upversioning, generating the
Mm-hmm.
build, preparing the articraft. After that, starting the deployment, release. After the web services. Once everything is completed, we want to generate the report and attach and send it to the receive notifications in the email.
Okay. And what kind of a report do you want here? When you say I need a report, what kind of a report are we looking at?
Yeah, suppose I did the deployment, and
Mm-hmm.
in that deployment, I created a new resource group, new app service, or
Mm-hmm.
updated all those details. What are all app services? What resource group we have used, and what is the web service application we have
Mm-hmm.
deployed, and what is
Okay.
the current version we have deployed,
Mm-hmm.
and what runtime. All these details we want to generate and generate a notification and send it to the
Mm-hmm.
to the clients or whatever the team, so that we can
Okay.
okay, this is the deployment details and like that.
Okay. Okay.
Is that possible, Kiran? Or after the
Yes.
deployment, setting
You will
automatic?
need a yes. You will need a custom PowerShell script for that. By the normal notifications, you can only go ahead and send whether your let's say pipeline has failed or a pipeline has passed or something of those sort out there. But if you want to go ahead and do some custom reporting, telling that what is the version of the release that went in, what is the version of the build that went in, what are all the things that got created during this particular release, and make a report out of it, you can. But you will need a custom PowerShell script for that, wherein you will have to, let's say, write an entire HTML and then send it over an email, or put it all in a JSON and send it across in an email, and so on and so forth. But yes, it is possible to do.
In real time, in your experience, normally this kind of development is happening.
Yes, definitely. I mean, you would have multiple clients that need reports and all these things. Yes, you can have such a kind of things. Yes.
Because I'm thinking we are more thinking over beyond that.
Hmm.
That's why I'm asking, like, whether this is something happening in real time now.
No, definitely. This is something that can happen in real time. That will happen in real time. Yes. Yes. Any more questions, guys? Anyone? Any questions here? All right. So let me do one thing. Let me take you all back to a couple of lectures. Let's see how far we remember, and then we'll try to implement the same lecture using Azure DevOps. So if you all remember, guys, a couple of lectures ago, we started with something called as SQL databases. We said, how do you create a SQL server? How do you create a SQL database? And we created one. So we created a server, and then we created a basic database under that particular server. So you have a server, you had a database, uh, both are basic in nature. And then I said that there are some SQL commands. Like, for example, I went ahead, gave a couple of SQL commands telling that there are some course details out here, and this how it looked like. Telling create a table called course, and then we inserted some records out there, and we just ran this particular, let's say, SQL commands, and we created some tables, and then we did some select star and all that stuff. And all these records were within the database, and you were, as an administrator, we were able to, let's say, go ahead and log into this particular SQL database, run some commands, get our outputs and all that stuff, right? After that, I said that I need this particular database or this particular data to be accessible over the internet. That's where I created an app service plan and an app service under it. So app service plan and app service under it, and then we connected the web app and the SQL server, these two components out here, using something called as a connection string. So we defined something called as a connection string out here within our app service. And I said that the connection string was called something like SQL connection or something like that. Reason being, your code needs that one or needs that connection string to be in this way. So we said there's something called a SQL connection, and your code needs a SQL connection out here and something like that. So we went ahead and did all these things, and then of course we went ahead and we spoke about something like application insights, and then the network and all these things out here as such. Before we went into traffic management, we spoke about all these concepts on a very broader picture. We integrated all these things out here as such. Now, do you all remember what we did? Does everyone remember? Did everyone practice this out?
Yeah,
Anyone feels that we not? Yes. Does everyone remember this, guys? Everyone? Yes, no, maybe.
yeah, we practiced this one.
Hmm.
We are able to create database and
Okay. Anyone who doesn't remember, probably I can ask the question the other way. Anyone who doesn't remember out there? Okay. So what I want to do in these set of lectures is that I want to do the same thing. I want to create the database, the server, the app service, the web app, and I also have the code. So I have a couple of things. A is that I need the infrastructure. When I say infrastructure, I'm talking about the SQL Server, the database, the plan, and the app service. I want all these things. Plus, I also want the connection string between them. I have the code. From this particular repository, I have my SQL app. This the code I something I have. It's a .NET 3.1 code. And if you'll remember, we built this code and then we published this code out here. And then C, I need the SQL commands, which I also have here. So I have all these things out here. One thing that I don't have is the infrastructure yet. I do not really have the infrastructure file that I build all these things out with. So I'll start there. I'll assemble everything together into one folder and then create a project out of it. And during this attempt, I would try to go ahead and cover, or I would rather go ahead and cover something called as a service called as a key vault in Azure. On what is a key vault in Azure, how is it used, and in this scenario, in these scenarios, like I'm taking one of the scenarios out here, how do we get in something called as a key vault is something that I would try to, let's say, cover in the coming set of lectures out here. So I'll start with here again. Uh, I will try to write, or I will write my infrastructure in something called as an ARM template language. So I will need an ARM template. And until today, right, we were doing the ARM template using Visual Studio, VS Code, sorry. Now, the easier way to do it, to build all these components, you could also be using your Visual Studio Server 2022 out here. You can do that. You can use Visual Studio not only to create a, let's say, a code out here. You can also use Visual Studio in order to create an ARM template, and it's actually more easier. Just with some clicks of button, you can go ahead and, let's say, create this out. And today I want to create a database and an app service. Now these things that I mean, or these are the entire things that I want to go ahead and create. The entire package is what I want to go ahead and create. So I'll say create a new project. And until today, we were telling ASP.NET Core. Now what I want to do is that I want to just type in ARM, or let's see, first group. Yes, there is something called Azure resource group. It's telling this template creates a resource group deployment project, will contain your artifacts, or it's telling, you know what, this type is used to go ahead and, let's say, simply go ahead and create an ARM template. So I said resource res resource. I said next, and it's now telling where do you want to create this out? Where do you want to create this out in? I'll just go ahead say this is web app SQL ARM template, some folder out here, and solution name, I'll say this is a web app SQL. Project name, I'll tell this is web app SQL. This is okay. .NET framework, I'll say create. And as and when I do that, it's now telling me what do you want to create? What is the exact thing that you want to create out here? Do you want to create a virtual machine? Do you want to create a virtual machine scale set? Do you want to create a logic app? Do you want to create a storage account? These are all the inbuilt templates. You can also get some GitHub templates directly. Many templates that are stored in the GitHub. There are a lot of templates, believe me, that are stored in the GitHub out here. It'll take some time to load all those things out. And setting one template found, but not really. It's just still loading out here. Let's do some quick stats. A lot of templates that are available out here, and you can choose from some preset definitions. You can just choose from, for example, there are about 1,000 templates out here. You can choose from some preset definitions out here. You can say, okay, fine, this is what I want. But today, what I need is I'll just go with Visual Studio templates that are inbuilt out here. And I want to create a web app plus an SQL server. So it's telling, you know what, it'll create you a flexible scaled web app, meaning you can also enable some scaling rules and all that stuff. And also it'll give you the application insights and all these things, also monitor alerting and all that stuff. I'll say, okay, this is what I want to go ahead and create. And with just some clicks of the button, right, it's going to create the entire template for you. Now today I'm not going and writing ARM slash nothing. I just said, okay, fine, going to Visual Studio. I said Azure Research Group, and I got my entire template out here. This is my entire template. So if I double click on this one, let me close this out. If I double click on this one, I have my entire template out here. And in order to, let's say, go through this template, right? Firstly, there are a couple of parameters like the app service plan name, the SKU of the app service, F1, and all these are the allowed values, B1, D1, and etc. And you can customize this template according to your own need. The SKU capacity, meaning the backend instance count, it's telling one. The administrator login for the SQL server and the administrator password, again a secure string out here. It's telling this is a secure string. The database name, again a string. Collation of the database, default value it's taking out here. Addition, it's telling is it basic, is it standard, is it premium? I'm telling it's a basic database out here. Maximum size in bytes, default value, I'm just taking this out. And then you have something called the requested object, which is a basic database out here that I'm taking, or the basic, let's say, database that I'm taking out here. And then I have a couple of variables telling what is my website name and what is the SQL server name. These are hard coded values out here as such. So what I would like to do is that I would also like to parameterize these values, telling the SQL server name and the website name out here. And then I have some resources that got created. Firstly, it created a SQL server inside which I have some database, some allowed IPs, so that all my Azure services can access this out. Again, I did not even touch this. I just went ahead, just created this entire template out of the blue. I mean, just did some clicks out here in my Visual Studio, got my entire template out here, and then I have my hosting plan. It's telling what is the SKU capacity of the hosting plan, meaning it's telling what is the name of the plan, what is the SKU capacity, and all that stuff. Then I have my website, meaning the web app, and also a connection string. If you see this, I have a connection string with my, let's say, web application. It has something called the value called default connection. This is something that I have to change to SQL connection because my code is expecting that particular value. And it's also, let's say, dynamically producing my value out here. It's dynamically going ahead and producing all my values out here as such. And also it has the auto scale settings and application insights component. I don't need this for now. I'll just delete them. So I'll just do a right click here, say delete. I don't need my application insights component, say delete out here. So I have all these things that I just created with clicks of some buttons, and I have my entire infrastructure file. Now what I want to do is that instead of having my SQL server name and the web app name both to be a dynamic value, meaning here it's dynamically trying to produce this out. I don't want that. I want this values to come from a parameter. So I'll just go ahead declare a parameter out here telling website name, or let me do one thing. This is a little bit difficult to edit out, so let me just change this out, save this, and I'll just get the entire JSON file, just place it under a folder so that I can upload all those things right away into my GitHub repository, into, let's say, my Azure repository out here. So let me go and get that. So this was the template, and inside that I have my entire solution file. I don't need all these things. I just need my template called web app SQL. This is the only thing that I need. And let me go back and create a new folder. I'll say assets, something like that. This is in here, and editing is always better. Editing is always easier in a VS Code. So I'll open this out in a VS Code, and now it's, let's say, it's telling this is a simple JSON. It's also loading my ARM templates out here as such. It's telling the loading template schema and all these things out here. So this is my entire template, and if I just click on the I button here, let me close all these things. All of these things are now getting created using the template that I just generated. So I just generated a template, did not create anything. One of the most easiest ways in which you can go ahead and, let's say, generate the entire JSON body, but I need to customize this out. So what I'll do is that I don't want the variables out here. This is what I was talking about. So after this object, I'll just put one more thing telling it is a new parameter and telling that this is a website name. and this is a dynamically or this is something that I want to pass using Azure DevOps. So the type here, I'm just putting it as a string. There's no default value at all. And after this, I also put a SQL Server name, telling a new parameter. Say it's a SQL Server name. So I'm making some changes, making some minute changes out here. I don't need this variable section at all. I'll remove these variables. And as and when I remove these variables, yes, it's going to throw errors because the variables are being referred. Change them to parameters. So wherever it's taking that particular reference, I'll just scroll down. I'll change this to parameters. Change this to parameters. Down here to parameters, parameters, and parameters. So I'm just changing the references out here so that I can give some parameters here, parameter values. And let's see, is it being referred somewhere else? Yes. So wherever the reference is happening, I'm just changing those references, and I'm allowing my template so that I'm making sure my template is error free. There are no errors right now. All good. What I'll now do is that I'll just change this default connection to SQL connection because my code is expecting the same thing. By default, it's going to create a connection string with a value called default connection. I'll just change this to SQL connection. Could be upper cases, could be lower cases, shouldn't be a problem. But on a safer side, I'll just go ahead and let's say tell that this is an SQL connection. This is what even my code is looking for, because if you look at the code and look at the services in the code and look at the service called this one, it's looking for something called as an SQL connection, and that's the reason I'm changing this particular value as a SQL connection out here as such. Again, all I'm doing is just taking the entire template, changing the nature of the template. I just changed, let's say, the variables out here, and I converted them into parameters, and I just went down and I just went ahead, and wherever the variables were being referred, I just changed them to parameters, and I changed the value of this particular connection because now this is a connection string that is getting generated out here. I just changed this value to something called SQL connection, and I have my template with me right now. Again, I would like you all to try this out because this is one of the most easiest ways in order to, let's say, go ahead and build a template out here. If you do not have a Visual Studio, I would suggest please install it on a virtual machine. You can take a Windows 10 virtual machine, install this out and delete it at a later point in time if you do not want it out. Or if you already have this particular, let's say, Visual Studio installed on your own machines, good enough, you can go ahead and build your entire template, make some minute changes, and get your infrastructure ready. Now my infrastructure is ready. The very first step, which I was telling, the infrastructure, this is ready. The rest of these things, right, which is code and SQL commands, are already there, so I don't really have to worry about it. The main thing or the main part was my infrastructure. It's all ready right now, so I have my infrastructure ready, and I have placed my infrastructure in something called assets. I'll just create a new folder out here telling that this is an infrastructure, and I'll just paste my template inside this. So I'm just moving my template inside the infrastructure folder out here as such, and my template is ready. Yes, any questions with regards to the infrastructure out here on how do we or how did we build the infrastructure? Any questions there? Anyone? Any questions there again?
Actually, I am not able to follow you. So how that SQL services were came? Did you copy that one? Kiran, can you go into that SQL
Yeah,
code?
into the SQL code. Which SQL code you're talking about? Just a second. So to hold you there, which SQL code are you talking about? Is it the ARM template or is it the SQL text file that you are looking at?
SQL text file.
SQL text file is already there in the repository. I mean, this is something that we used, right? This is something that we used earlier for our demos, didn't we?
So the same you copied here, or the same you are downloaded through the Git. You are not
Just
using.
a second. Just a second. That's what I was telling is that I did not download this out yet. I just have my infrastructure ready with me right now. These two, I will download it. B and C, I will download it. A is something that I just created using my Visual Studio. That's it. I have my infrastructure with me, and I am just placing my infrastructure into a folder called, let's say I have something called assets. Inside that, I have a folder called infra. Inside that, I have my template. This is just my template that I created, or this is just my template that I generated, and I made some changes out here. So yes, what's your question here?
What is the reason of opening this in the initially you opened in the Visual Code, after that you copied and you pasted in some other folder, and again you opened in JSON format. Yeah, why you copied that one, Kiran, from ARM template to JSON file format?
No, I did not copy it anywhere. I was just arranging my folders. That's it. All I did is I arranged a folder and I just opened this out. That's it. I just did a folder arrangement. I just put it
He's
in a different folder.
asking
Sorry.
you, you opened
Mhm.
it in uh, Visual Code, but opened in for editing purpose. It is easy
Yes,
for
for
you.
editing
So
purpose, yes.
you open in
So
Visual
for
VS Code.
yes, I wrote the template or I generated the template using Visual Studio. This entire thing is in Visual Studio. But for editing, this is not the best suited tool until unless you have a very good understanding of JSON. That's the reason I just opened this out in VS Code and then I was editing this out. And once edited, I placed it inside a folder so that it's easy for me to, let's say, have all my assets in one place and I can go ahead and, let's say, upload it inside a Git repository. That is what I did. Does that answer your question, Ramakrishna?
Yeah, understand. I think as based upon your experience, you are going and you are selecting that appropriate
Hmm.
service. As a newcomer, like how will we know? How will we get to know that what are all services we have and how we can select and based upon? You have shown
Again,
through the Git and
correct. Again, it all depends upon what is your requirement. When I'm your client, I'm telling that, you know what, hey Ramakrishna, I want these services to be created. So I am telling, okay, fine, I want an app service. Probably I want a storage account. I want a connection between those two things. So probably this is your requirement. So now you are breaking things down, telling that in an infrastructure, I want all these things out here. I want to create this out. And this infrastructure is just generated. Now, this infrastructure that we are, let's say, looking at, it was just generated based upon the previous demo that we did, right? So as a newcomer, let's say if you are, let's say, really looking at this one, telling that what are the services that I want to create, it completely depends upon the requirement that you had or the requirement that you have out here as such, telling that these are the services that I want and this is how I want to create my template. It's completely dependent upon the requirement out there.
If it is a custom requirement, Kiran,
Hmm. Hmm.
so then going to Visual Code, Visual
Hmm.
Studio Code,
Okay.
and what templates are available, just to the basic templates, so that we can
Hmm.
download and modify it. And
Again,
also
when you say Visual Studio Code, do you mean Visual Studio's full
Visual,
version or
Visual Studio, sorry. Okay.
right?
So,
So again, here you have everything or every service that you can create in Azure is available here. So if I say new project or solution and just go ahead and let's say yes, I'll choose my repository. Fine. Sorry, I'm trying to open the service. Okay, fine. New, I'll say project, and if I go into my resource groups and say create something, this is going to give you every service that is available in Azure, the basic template of every service that is available in Azure, and I am just customizing it according to what I want. For example, these are some Visual Studio templates. You have a logic app, you have web app, you have service web cluster and all that stuff. For example, if I go and I want, let's say, much more, many more templates out here. For example, there's some quick start out here as such. And then I want something like storage account with virtual network enabled. So I'll just say storage. Depends upon what is the server or what is the kind of service that I need. Not storage, just your RAG storage. So it's going to tell you all the services that are going to start with storage, all the services that are being used in the storage. Again, this is just another copy of your documentation in the ARM template documentation out here. There is something called references section, template references. Inside this, all these are the templates. Everything that you see here is a template out here. For example, storages, storage accounts. It's going to tell you what kind of a template you want. And if you click on ARM and just scroll down here, there is something called as a quick start templates, telling how do you want to, let's say, create a standard storage account, or create a storage account with advanced threat protection, or you want to create a storage account with a blob container. Just click on this one. It's going to take you to the
These are
GitHub page.
predefined templates, right? For
These
a
are predefined
particular
templates,
use,
exactly.
for a particular use case.
Okay.
So in a real, so we might need to do a lot of customization. Like
Yes, correct.
in that case, we need to have a better understanding on looking at
Again,
template itself, where to modify,
that's
where to delete, to add, and all.
mhm, yes. So that again is completely experience, Nimar. I mean, that's something that you will gain over an experience. That's something that is not available over the internet. That's where knowledge skill set comes into picture, right? It
That's
completely depends upon what kind of modifications you want to enable. And what I'm telling is that you have a base template. On this base template, then yes, you'll have to build with your own knowledge skill set out there that we have gained so far. So it depends upon, if for example you want a virtual network, then you have a virtual network template. The thing here you need to understand is that how do I connect my virtual network to a SQL server? How do I put that connection in place, and so on and so forth. Customization is something that we have to do, or customization is something that we have to we have to do after a lot of thinking process. Once we have our knowledge set in place, that's where customization comes into play. But predefined templates is something that you can find. Using that predefined template as your base, you can build on top of that.
one other question.
Go
We
please.
have seen the looking at the code, we have seen the designer also, right? Like connections,
hmm
it has shown.
right, right.
So if you modify design, let's say, if you have a better understanding on the design, if you
hmm
modify that, the code will also change accordingly,
yes, the code will also change accordingly. Yes.
right? If you want to introduce, let us say, load balancer, for example.
hmm hmm
So you bring a load balancer and add to the diagram.
right.
Automatic balancer module code will be uh, incorporated in the template, right?
Yes. It has to be incorporated within the template. Yes.
So if
So
we
once
in
you
the
have the diagram, it's modified.
hmm yes, that's where our sprint planning even starts with diagram. We have a word with the architect, understand what exactly is there in their mind, because design of the entire infrastructure is something that I, as a DevOps engineer, I do not do it. Design of the infrastructure is something that from an architecture level I get the understanding that okay, fine, this is my design. And since I do not have an architect right now explaining, since I am only doing the entire course, I'm going ahead and, let's say, working like an architect and telling that yes, this is my design. And if there are multiple components that are added, yes, my template will change. My template should change accordingly.
How, I mean, which one is easier, changing the design or changing the code?
When you say changing the design is
Changing the
always tough.
diagram.
Yes. Changing the design is always tough, because design changes are usually structural in nature. Because when you change a design, and as an architect, I'll have to think about a lot of things, telling that, what, this design compatible with the code that I have, or is this design something that is compatible with the security that my organization follows. So usually designs do not change, the design remains the same. But components may be added to your design. Probably they want to add a virtual network in place, or probably they want to add application insights, auto scaling in place, and all these things out. Then your template grows according sorry, then your template grows accordingly. So design usually doesn't change entirely. There's something that can be added to a design, but usually there's something that doesn't really change in a design, from a design perspective as such. You see more questions, please? Go please.
We didn't get you. Like, according to the template, the project will be configured. That visual code in the, like, you have to.
According to the template, no. According to the diagram, my template will be configured. Or
Where
according to the project design, my template will be configured. Yes.
where we will design that one, Kiran? Can you show where it is designed? Where we
When you
can
say
add that?
uh, when you say designed, can you please elaborate on this one? When you say what exactly do you want to design out here? Sorry.
No, actually, we are. No, you are discussing that. Okay, we can add the components like based upon the design, the configuration will be added.
Mm-hmm.
Build.
Mm-hmm.
Designer Kiran. Can you show that design?
The Visual Studio design you're talking about.
Yes,
Sorry,
yeah, correct.
this one. So Ramakrishna, there are two things that let me clear out a couple of things. There are two things out here that you're talking about. One, when you say design, it's the architectural design that I'm talking about. This is my architectural design.
This is high level on the flow chart. It's nowhere related to the code, right? It's a
No,
high
no,
level.
No, not
it's
this one.
based on
He's asking.
just a second. Yeah, just a second. Sorry, just a second. Based on this one, I have created a template. This is my editor, right? I created a template out here. Fine, I'll say back. So I went here, set a new project. So I started here. I said new project, put new, let's say new, okay, just a little, fine. I said new project and I designed my template here. So this is how I designed my template. And I got my design telling it, okay, fine, you know what, I need these components, telling that I have a SQL Server database, app service and app service plan, also a connection string between all these things, because this is what we need for this particular project. This is what we need. And this is
Mhm.
what I have. And I said, okay, fine, you know what, since I go with a basic web app plus a SQL Server, I just said, okay. And I created my entire template. This is where I created my template, or this is where I generated my template. Now you can edit your template from this one. Say view solution explorer. I can edit my template here. Edit it, provided you have a good amount of JSON understanding. But what I said is that instead of editing here, you can open the same template using Visual Studio. Let's say open a new window or open a folder. Using a Visual Studio, I can open the same template out here.
Earlier also it is in Visual Studio only, right?
No, it
No?
is not. It is a Visual Studio server out here. Now I'm opening it in a Visual Studio Code to edit it. You can edit it here. I mean, you can edit it optionally here, but I'm editing it here because it's going to be easy for you to go ahead and let's say do that. Earlier it was not. I wrote my template out here. I've written my entire template here. You can write this entire thing using Visual Studio Code, edit it using a Visual Studio Code. But I'm just telling there's an easier option that is available to generate your template and then edit it later using a Visual Studio Code out here. Again, you can edit it here. You can go ahead and edit it here out here within the Visual Studio console. Shouldn't be a problem at all. But I am giving you an
So
option.
this
Mhm. Good, please.
Visual Studio server, did you open it in on your local machine?
Yes, it's in my local. Everything that I'm doing is on my
So that's
local
why
right
you were
now.
able to save it onto the folder and opened in Visual Studio Code.
Correct.
Okay, one other thing, if you can, let's say, assuming you are the architect, you have given the
Okay.
diagram
Okay.
drawn, right,
Okay.
in the draw.io. So that diagram you have given as an architect, I'm the DevOps
Yes.
engineer. I have to build the code, for example, in ARM
Okay.
template.
Okay.
So can I go ahead onto the Visual Studio server and draw this diagram and get the code
No,
and edit
you
it
cannot do that.
if I need it?
No, you cannot do that. You cannot draw this entire diagram and then get the code. You cannot do that. You will have to, let's say, start from a base, and you cannot get a custom diagram out here. So I am, if I just put a diagram in here, Visual Studio will not or cannot understand how to generate a code out of it. I generated a base code depending upon the components that I have. Let's say tomorrow they've added, let's say, a new thing out here. Then I will have to, let's say, make sure that I provision this particular resource and make sure that this resource is present within the template out here as such. So template editing is something that we have to do. We cannot just take the diagram and convert it into this one. So that's the reason we will need to understand what are all the services that are there. Or the other option that you have, the easier way you can do that is you can just create all these resources on your Azure portal. Now, if you have an Azure portal, you can just go ahead, create all these resources, and then export the template for this particular resources. That could be the other way in which you can, let's say, go ahead and do accomplish all these things out here as such.
So can you go to the designer and the code, Visual Studio, sorry,
Okay.
and click on the eye. You show the eye
Okay.
icon.
So that's here. Okay.
So here, if you can just put one component, one, let's say load balancer or
Hmm.
scaling, just for
You
the
mean here? Here?
seeing the code, how it, yeah, can
You
we do that
no,
here?
no, we can't do that. This is generated out of the code. So whatever you have in your code, that's what
Okay, I
it's
cannot
enabled
modify.
out here, sir. You cannot modify this.
Okay.
This is a read-only format. This is a read-only
Oh,
format out
okay,
here that you get. So it
okay,
is generated depending upon the code, not the other way around.
okay, got it. So, but in AWS, right,
Hmm.
CloudFormation, you can edit it,
Okay.
and code will change accordingly. CloudFormation allows.
Hmm. Right. CloudFormation does allow that. I mean, I haven't done a lot of, let's say, work on CloudFormation, but
You have
yes,
a
it
designer,
does.
you can
But
go ahead
mhm.
and modify. That's
But yeah, ARM, I don't think you have something like that, but I'll see if there is any online extension as such. But we generally do not have any online extension, something like that, which generates a JSON based upon the object that you add here. That's something that is not available as per the best knowledge that I do have.
Here only. Okay, this is the
right. There is a download option. There's a download for the diagram or download for the code
It's just the download for the
at the
diagram.
right top.
So it'll just go ahead and help you
Oh,
download the diagram out here. It's an image for, let's say, for your ease of understanding out here as such.
it's a kind of pictorial representation
The
of the.
representation of the code, exactly. It's the pictorial representation of the code that you have.
That's it. So Kiran
So
here.
all I do, good, please.
So Kiran, here we have SQL databases and all. Like
Hmm.
as per Nirmal, like if you want to add a load balancer, okay, take a load balancer as example. Yes, there will
Okay.
be some template for load balancer also, right?
Hmm.
In the
Hmm.
Azure, maybe
Hmm.
Git or base template.
Right.
So, yeah, can we merge that load balancer template and this one so that the loader balancer will also come into this if we merge that code here?
When you say merge that code, very importantly, when you talk about load balancer, you'll need to tell what is the network in which it sits in. So you'll need a virtual network. Then you need to tell what is the backend pools. So you need to mention the backend pool out here. So again, you cannot merge it that way. You
Okay,
cannot just
here,
go ahead and, let's say,
we cannot take load balancer as example. What is the best example? Like, can we add one more database here, one more schema, or one more server? How we can
just
add
okay.
like merging two templates?
You cannot merge. That's what I was saying. You cannot merge. You will need to add it here. For example, in my case, I have some resources out here. Let's see, this is my sites, and let's go ahead. This is my server, and inside my server, I have a database. This is a child resource. This is
Hmm,
the entire database.
correct.
Either I need to put in a copy index, or I need to, let's say, replicate this entire block. Telling it, okay, fine, I need a new database out here with the same definition under the server out here as such. I cannot
Copy.
merge it.
so
Yes,
if
I
you can,
either do.
you can just copy paste the load balancer code here. I mean the diagram. I think to your point,
Hmm.
if you copy paste the load balancer code somewhere
Hmm.
here in the resources, of course
Right.
will throw errors. But in
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
diagram, it will show the diagram somewhere, right? Like load
Yeah,
balancer.
it will show the diagram somewhere that there is a load balancer component.
Load balancer also. But how do you connect? You need a network
You need a
representative
virtual network for that. Yes, you will
network and
need all
pools
those
and all
components out here. Yes, the
to make
pools
it
and
to
all
work.
these things. Yes, to make
Then
it
you need to
work.
modify.
then you need to modify. Yes. So either. So that's where I was telling that yes, this is a good tool to edit. So you can go ahead use two different combinations out here. So one you have a Visual Studio Code, and in a Visual Studio Code, I'm just going ahead and editing it out because it's better way to edit it. The IntelliSense works really better out here. Or let's say you have Visual Studios out here, same template open in Visual Studios. Let's say to add to let's say Ramakrishna's point, you want one more database. I can do a right click here, say add a new resource, and inside that, I now tell okay fine, what is the resource that you want. Let's say I want a database, so it's a SQL database. I'll say demo database, something like that. I'll say add. So what it did right now is that it added one more database inside this. The simple, you're just going ahead into a VS code, and I said that you'll have to just copy this out entirely and paste it out once again. That's what the editor did for you. You can say
Correct.
add one more resource. You can say, for example, let's say something like you ask for a load balance. Again, there are limited amount of support here. For example, I need one more resource out here. Let's say add one more resource. And there's a limited support out here that you can, let's say add from. Let's say a virtual machine. Then it's going to ask you what is a storage account, what is a virtual network, and all that stuff. In that way, for example, you want a virtual network. I'll say some demo. They add this out. And now this is my entire code. So if I now copy this entire code out here, now I have a demo virtual network as well. Paste it inside this one. And now I have a network as well. And I have multiple databases out here as such.
Correct.
So this is good to add. Like, it's you can go ahead, let's say, add this out in multiple, let's say, ways out here. Again, you can add new resource. You can add child resources to a parent resource. You can do that. Good enough. But again, you need a combination of things. ARM templates are not straightforward. You need a combination of things in order to, in order to, let's say, go ahead and edit things out here as such. Telling that probably I want a resource, or like, let's say something like a virtual network, or according to my design, I need a load balancer. So you'll need to add that code here, do the modifications. Again, that's what I was telling is that to do a modification or to write a template, you can either use Visual Studio or VS Code. Until today, we were using VS Code. Today, I'm also telling that, okay, fine, you can use Visual Studio to also do this. But for editing, for the purpose of editing, I can just go ahead, let's say, edit this out, not a problem. But for the purpose of editing, VS Code is a better tool. It loads the IntelliSense out in a better way. It helps you, let's say, go ahead and do, or swiftly build your template and all that stuff out here as such.
Because that is the editor, right? Purpose of it is to edit.
Yes, exactly. Purpose of editor. This is more like a generator for you. Generates all your templates. It's better in generation. You can also generate your templates here by just typing in ARM and those things out here. But this gives you kind of a GUI to edit things out.
This we call it as Visual Server, Kiran. This one,
It's a
these
Visual
three.
Studio. This is a Visual Studio. It's a Visual Studio Full Server 2022, and this is a VS Code. So
Okay, Visual.
using a Visual Studio, we were creating our code like a .NET application and so on and so forth, right? And today I'm using the same thing, and I'm now going ahead and telling that I want to go ahead and create something like a ARM template out here. Now even that's supported out here is my point.
Also, Kiran, you changed the SQL connection strings, right? SQL
Correct.
database connection.
Correct.
Normally, in real time, we will get that connection string details from the DBAs, right? Once the DB is
From the developers, because this is from my code, right? So the developer has designed this particular core service. So this is completely a developer's playground, and this is where they said, okay, fine, I would use something called as an SQL connection. And they're now telling, okay, fine, this code is referring to an SQL connection. So my template also needs to have something like an SQL connection. And that's the reason I changed in my template, telling that from a default connection, I change this out to SQL connection out here as such.
okay. Basically, that details we will get from the developers. Which database they are using, the same database connection strings we have to use here to configure or set up that.
Which value they are using, then yes, that's the same value that we are using out here as such. Again, for the ease of everyone, I have placed the template as well inside this particular folder. So if you do want to take a look at this template for your reference, you can use this entire section, but I want you all to generate the template, guys. This is what I want you to try generating it out. Generate this template, and if you are comfortable editing the template inside the same Visual Studio, you're good to go ahead and do that. The Visual Studio editor is good enough to edit this out, but doesn't really load any IntelliSense and all these things. So you have to be a little careful while editing this out here. But if you want something like a better way to edit this out, then open the same template using a Visual Studio Code, and then you can start editing. You have a base, you can start editing on top of that particular base out here as such. And that's my entire infrastructure, which is a SQL Server, database, plan, app services, and also the connection string embedded inside the template. I'm taking the entire template, putting it inside a folder called infra, so that I can go ahead and, let's say, commit all these things into an Azure repository out here, put policies on top of that particular repository, and do a lot of things out here as such. So this is what I have done so far. So is any questions still here? Any more questions still here that I can take before I move forward?
Normally, you are using Visual Code and all
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
modify the ARM templates and to
Hmm.
configure to download the template to manage. In
Hmm.
real time, also, like in a client in the projects, also we use the Visual Code itself. Or is there any alternate way or any other application softwares where we can use to generate the ARM templates?
Again, you have Notepad++, lightweighter option, but again, you have to, let's say, write your own templates out here. So 90% of the times when I have used ARM templates, or to be honest, 99% of the times when I use ARM templates or Terraforms or something like that, VS Code is one of the best options. VS Code is one of the best options. Visual Studio is something that I very barely use, only when I am creating some new resources, which I do not really have an understanding about. I'll try to generate the entire template and see how the template gets generated, and then, let's say, start editing it out using a VS Code. But 99% of the times, VS Code is a one-stop solution. That's the best editor that you can actually go for out here as such.
So blindly we can say wherever there is a Azure DevOps project, VS Code is available. No need to worry.
Definitely, I mean, you can. It is available generally to, kind of work, until unless you're coming from a Linux infrastructure platform. And again, if you're a Linux based, where it doesn't really support a GUI, that's where VS Code doesn't. You cannot really go ahead and, let's say, I think you can install VS Code on this one as well. But yes, I can check that. But yes, normally when you are writing an ARM template or a Terraform scripting or something like that, VS Code is one of the most versatile tool that people normally use.
Okay.
Is there any more questions again? So I have my code. Okay, so I have all my code placed in one place. So I have my SQL application. I have the SQL commands as well. I have all these things out. So what I'll do, I'll just download my code out here. So the code from, again, I am not writing this code. I'm just downloading this code out here, making it available so that I can, start working with this. I'll just open this out. Fine. Let it get downloaded. And once I go into the download section, I have this one. I'll again copy this out, place it into the same folder where I have my infrastructure. So inside the assets, I'll just go ahead, create a new folder called code, place this in, extract it out. And once extracted, I'll make sure that my code is also available. Let's see, okay, fine. These are double folders that got created. I can remove this out. I'll remove the zip file. I don't need this. I have my code, all my code that I downloaded. I don't want to build my code. And this is the second thing that I have a code. So if I just open the entire folder out here in VS Code, just show you all what are the assets that I do have. I have a couple of folders out here, one being the code. It's in .NET 3.1, designed in .NET 3.1 out here. I just downloaded this code, and I have my infrastructure templates that I created or generated using Visual Studio and did some editing using the Visual Studio code. Again, you can do the editing as well using Visual Studio, shouldn't be a problem at all. But it's easier for you to go ahead and let's say do it using a Visual Studio. And finally, the third component, which I would say I'll just create a new folder. I will say SQL or SQL commands to put it in a better way. And I have all my commands already. I have all these commands. So what I'll do is I'll just copy all these commands out here. I'll go back into my file. I'll say add a file here. I'll say SQL commands or commands.sql, something like this. An SQL file that I'm creating. The reason that I'm creating an SQL file is now I'm not manually taking all these commands and let's say adding it, or not manually going in and let's say doing this operation. Rather, I'm coming via Azure DevOps. So that's the reason I'm creating an SQL file out here. I'll remove all the comments. So it's telling this is create a table. There are a couple of statements. I'm just arranging all these statements accordingly. And then I have a select statement out here. I don't need this drop. For now, I'll just remove this out. And I have my entire code. The SQL commands is something that I have. I just removed all those things like, I was just explaining a couple of things out here telling that below are the comments to create a table and all that stuff. So all these things is something that I removed. And I now have an SQL file. So three things is what I have. I have my infrastructure, I have the code, I have the SQL commands. I'll introduce the key vault in a later point. We'll see what exactly is the key vault, where exactly it comes into picture. First, we'll understand the very basic of it, and then we'll understand what is the need of a key vault and how do I introduce something known as a key vault. So I have all these things placed inside a folder called assets. Now all I'll do is that I'll now want to store all these things inside my GitHub or inside my Azure repository. So I'll go back into my DevOps, into my ATM project. I'll create a new repository out here telling SQL DevOps, something like this. To create this out. Again, main branch, I'm telling this is only for, let's say, something like a backup purpose. So I'll create a new branch. I'll log this out firstly. I'll create a new branch called develop based out of the main branch. I'll say that this is the default branch of my repository. I'll add policies onto this particular branch. So I'll say branch policies, and I'll say require minimum number of reviews, at least one reviewer out here. And I'll say allow requesters to approve their own change because I just want to, let's say, approve my own change out here as such. I'll say work items must be linked, comments must be result. All this is checked and the branch has policies right now. I don't want anyone to directly commit on top of this particular branch. And I'll also put a work item for myself on the Azure board telling push the assets, something like that. So that I have a work item with me right now. And now I'll just go ahead and do a clone of this particular repository, develop branch of this particular repository in a VS Code. Let's open this out. I'll just make a copy of this particular repository inside my local machine. So I'm just cloning this entire I'm just cloning this entire repository in my local machine right now. I'll say yes, open a new window. So now I have something called SQL DevOps, and I'm working with the develop branch of this particular repository. All I'll do is just copy all my assets. That's the code, the infra, and etc. inside the code repository that I just cloned. I'm just copying everything out here inside the code repository that I've cloned out here. Reason being, I want to upload all these things, or I want to, let's say, push all these things inside Azure repositories right now. So now I have all these changes that are ready to be committed. These changes are my code, the infrastructure, and the SQL commands, everything in place. All I'll simply do is just say stage everything. All these are stage changes. I'll say pushing the packages or pushing the assets. I'll say commit. And before I push the changes back in, I cannot directly push it. The reason being I have branch policies on my branch. I'll just say create a new branch. I'll just say some feature, Kiran asset push based out of the develop branch. I'll say publish the branch out here as such. And once I'm publishing the branch, I'll make sure to just refresh my screen on Azure DevOps. I have a branch out here. I'll create a pull request into the develop. These are all, let's say, the files that are in place. Everything is good enough. One commit telling asset is being pushed. I'll say create this out. I need to link the work item. So I'll link the work item out here. Set this to autocomplete, delete the branch after it is merged, and approve this out. Again, just a regular procedure. Once approved, I have all my changes, which is code, infra, SQL commands, everything inside the develop branch of my repository. So I have, sorry, so I have the SQL app, I have the CS project file with the SQL app, I have the infrastructure, I have, let's say, the SQL commands, everything out here. Now, the next step here from my repository, I would create a build pipeline for the ASP.NET application. So I'll say pipelines. I already have a pipeline, but I'll say new pipeline out here. I'll say use classic editor. I'll say the pipeline or the code entirely is in Azure Repos Git. This is the project. This is the repository name. This is the branch. I'll say continue. Just scroll down. I'll say this is ASP.NET Core. I'll apply this out. Now I have the entire thing which is selling restore, build, and etc. Agent, I'll just go ahead and take the Windows 2019 server. I'll say where is your project to be built, or what is the CS project of your, let's say, project out here. This is what it's asking me for. So if I go inside the repository into the code, into this particular folder, this is the file, this is the path of the file it's asking me for. So I'll just copy this out. I'll remove this and I'll say this is where you'll find the CS project, and it's asking where's your test project out here. Now this particular SQL application code, right, it doesn't have a test project. I do not have a test project out here as such, so there's no test cases out here. So I'll say I'll remove this out. I'll remove the test cases. I'm good with that. And now I have the restore, the build, the publish. I'll just remove this out. Yes, the publish. It's telling please go ahead and publish it out. And apart from this, I'll also change the name to SQL web build, something like this. Apart from these, I also have my JSON files and my SQL files that need to be copied. So I'll add two more tasks. I'll say copy files. I'll say copy infra. Source folder, I'll select this as infra out here. I'll say yes. I'll copy all the contents of the infra folder to the target folder, which is nothing but the artifact staging directory. So I'll say this is the artifact staging directory out here. And I'll just clone this task. I'll say clone. I'll say copy SQL files. I also need the SQL commands that I basically stored inside my repository. I'll say copy SQL. Change this to SQL commands. I'll say OK. And this is my build pipeline. Just doing a restore, build, publish, also copying my infrastructure files, also copying my SQL files, publishing the entire package into the Artifactory. And I can put a continuous integration trigger out here so that whenever the develop branch is updated, the entire code can go ahead and, let's say, go ahead and build automatically by itself. I'll just save and queue and save and run. So this is the first run that I'm giving into this particular project. So I used the default ASP.NET Core template. Plus I added two steps here. One step is to copy the JSON files. The other step is to copy the SQL files that I do have inside my repository. The reason that I'm copying is because in my release pipeline, I want to firstly build the infrastructure. So I would need the JSON files. Then I want to, let's say, push the code. So I need a .zip file that is generated. And after I push the code, I want to now go ahead and, let's say, run this particular SQL commands onto the database. So I need to do all these things. So I have my pipeline firstly doing a build and also copying and giving me a consolidated artifact for everything. So I'll have a zip file, I'll have a JSON file after this is being built, and then I have a .sql file out here that I can start using it with my release pipeline out here as such. So this is what I'm doing on an end-to-end basis. And in my release pipeline is where I'm going to do all these, all the, let's say, deployment, the infrastructure, the code deployment, and the SQL commands deployment. And finally going to introduce something called as a key vault as such out there. So now if you see this is done, and if I now check the artifacts, I have the commands.sql, the SQL app.zip, the website SQL.json. These are the three assets that I have, let's say, built out using the pipeline out here as such. Yes, any questions here?
Where are we copying these commands .sql?
Yeah. Yeah.
Where are we
Why are we
copying?
copying the commands? Sorry, can you come in,
No,
please,
no,
with
no.
the question,
Why?
please?
Where we are copying to?
We are just copying it to the artifact folders. So all these are the artifact tree, right? So we're copying it inside the artifact tree of my build pipeline.
These are to be executed against the database, right? The SQL Server
Yes,
database
these are to be
from
executed
the
against
SQL.
the SQL. Exactly. These are to be executed against the
But
SQL
why we?
database. Sorry, go ahead, please.
No, no. Are these commands are going to execute automatically, or we should run these commands?
Very importantly, when you say these commands need to be executed, right? I would need a pipeline to execute them. That's where I'm telling that I would execute all these things using a release pipeline. And my release pipeline needs to access these assets. That's the reason I'm producing these assets under the artifacts. So yes, we will execute this automatically using an Azure DevOps release pipeline against a database that we build using an Azure DevOps build pipeline and this particular JSON, Azure DevOps release pipeline and this particular JSON file out here as such.
Kiran, you are
Go ahead, please.
copying commands, SQL commands, you are copying here to run on the database. So
Mhm.
this we call it as a infra as a code, right? So whatever the JSON file, that is a infra, and the SQL commands is a kind of code. Infra as a code you are deploying, right?
No, as in when you put an ARM template, it's called itself as an infra as a code. Infra as a code meaning infrastructure being stored in the form of a code, meaning infrastructure being stored in the form of a JSON file, ARM templates. So if you are executing ARM templates using Azure DevOps pipelines, we call it as or ARM templates or Terraforms or CloudFormation or whatever it is. If your infrastructure is stored in the form of a code, PowerShell, ARM, or Terraforms or something like that, we call it as an infra as a code. Here, SQL is coming into picture. Reason being, when we manually did all these things, we went ahead inserted the SQL, let's say commands inside the database, right? So I want to build all these things, deploy the code, and also insert all my, let's say, SQL commands using a release pipeline in Azure DevOps out here as such. And then I want to improve on the security by using something called as a key vault. That's where I'm introducing something, or that's where I would be introducing something known as a key vault out here as such.
Correct. Except the commands.sql remaining all, we can tell that it's a infrastructure application, right?
Except, so in the entire workflow, this is the only infra as a code. Now, this is your code that is given by a developer for the normal CI/CD. But as in when you introduce your infrastructure
Correct.
in the form of a JSON file, we are now calling this as an infra as a code out here as such.
Correct. SQL app.zip is nothing but it's SQL commands only, right, Kiran?
No, this is not the commands. This is your artifacts. These are your, for example, this is all your code, right? Here you have all your code, and inside that you have the SLN file. You have all these things out here. So I built all these things using the pipeline, and I converted these ones into a .zip file. So for example, if you look at our earlier release pipeline, earlier build pipeline that we're doing, right? It had these two things: the .zip, which is the code, and the .json, which is your infrastructure. In my pipeline right now, I have something which is very similar, which is a .zip, which is the built version of my code, being the code that the developer has given me, a .sql file, my SQL commands that I need to execute it against the database, and my JSON file that will help me build the entire infrastructure. When I say entire infrastructure, it means the resource group, it means the app service plans, it means the app service, it means the SQL server, it means the SQL server, it means the SQL database, and then it means the connection between all these things out here as such. So all these things consolidated is what I'm producing in the form of the artifact, and I would like to use these artifacts going forward using an Azure DevOps release pipeline.
Okay.
SQL app is the one that you downloaded, right, from somewhere?
SQL app is the one that I downloaded, yes. SQL app is the one that I just downloaded from, let's say, that particular repository here. This one. And I converted this into a SQL app.zip. So I built this out. So this is all in a high level language, .NET 3.1. And I built this out into DLLs. And my pipeline did that for me, doing a restore build and all these things. These are the steps. My pipeline did all these things for me and converted it into a .zip format. So if you download this .zip format and kind of take a look at that, so it's a SQL app.zip. So it's the same thing that I downloaded here. So if I just go here, and if I just open this out or extract this out here, it's all a converted version of it. It's all the DLL version of my code. So I just converted the entire code into a DLL version of it so that I can use it against, or I can use it, let's say, with a release pipeline and deploy it into an app service and then, let's say, get it functional.
This is to create the database, right? Schema and all that.
Sorry, can you come again, please?
The SQL app is basically the code is written which will accomplish to create the schema and make the database ready on the SQL Server instance.
No, this is not on the SQL Server instance. This is in place so that you can go ahead.
Yeah. SQL instance is in the JSON file that we have created.
SQL instance, yes, it's in the JSON file that you created. The schema that you're talking about inside the SQL Server, all this is taken care by the SQL commands. So all you have is a database, and inside that you are now creating a table. This code is for the application itself to connect to the database and extract the data. This is not for the schema. It is not to create, let's say, the SQL schema out here. This is for the application so that you can deploy it out. So three things out here that we're talking about, right? One is your code. This is to drive your application. It's your web app.
Application random codes, is it? That application we are talking about?
Correct. So that's the random codes application. Here I'm telling that the SQL app is that now the application code, which will help you drive your application as such, meaning your web app as such. So deployed on this particular web app. This, whenever you start this particular web app, it will go ahead and, let's say, try to connect to a database and all these things.
This will basically makes a connection to the database.
Correct. This will attempt to make a connection to the database. Yes, correct.
So currently the credentials are embedded in this code, and you are going to show it in the vault. How do we secure that, right, later?
As of now, it is not embedded in the code as well. So if you look at this one, this is my infrastructure, the one that creates my infrastructure right now. And if I just look into the in this one here, you mean?
Yeah. It has the credentials, right, to connect.
No, it doesn't have the credentials. Again, it doesn't really have the credentials. So even if you look at your services file, it's just telling that go ahead and get the credentials from the web app. And how does the web app get the credentials in the first place? It's because it has a connection string out here, right? So you are going ahead generating this particular connection string, and this connection string is referring out to something called as the administrator login and the password. These are your credentials.
Okay, this is a
And if
hard
you
code.
look at these one, yes, this is also not hard coded. This is referring to a parameter, right? So if I
Right.
go back into that particular parameter, the parameter doesn't have a value at all. The parameter, if I just go back into the parameter out here, the parameter doesn't have a value at all. It just says it's a secure string. I would pass these parameters during the
Hmm.
runtime
Okay.
values using Azure DevOps.
And the web app will take from here. Whenever you
Exactly.
pass
The web
line
app
branch,
will pick it
it
up
will
from
make
here. Correct. It'll pick it up from here. So that's where my release pipeline comes into picture. And that's where I would elaborate on my release pipeline, telling how exactly all this infrastructure is created and how the connection strings are put in place. Again, this might seem very, very confusing. If you haven't practiced, guys, the previous classes on how do you create the web app and all these things and then connect all these things out here, it would be a little bit of Greek and Latin. What I did is that just put all these things into one place, uploaded it into an Azure repository out here so that I can automate the entire workflow. So that's what I'm doing right now to automate the entire workflow out here. I have now my code which will drive my application. I have the SQL commands which are required for the database. And then I have the ARM template, meaning the JSON file, which will help me create the infrastructure out here. And using a release pipeline of Azure DevOps, I'll just go ahead and let's say using release pipeline, using the variables that we learned earlier, I'll integrate all these things together and then start, let's say, deploying things out and so on and so forth out here as such.
So whatever the parameters we define here at the time of release pipeline, automatically in the release pipeline window, it will ask for the parameters, right? Then
Correct. Correct. And I will pass all these parameters not directly, but by using Azure DevOps variables.
variables. Automatically it will ask there. It will
Yes,
stop there.
it'll automatically going to it's going to ask you there, telling what are all the parameters you want to declare, and I will declare all these parameters as an Azure DevOps variable so that I can reproduce the same thing into multiple environments like dev, QA, staging, prod, and all that stuff.
What it will show, Kiran, in the release pipeline, it will show as a red asterisk. It's a mandatory. If you define here parameters, it will show in that screen mandatory as it,
Not
or
really.
it will
If you
just
look
like
at your release pipeline earlier, so this was my earlier release pipeline, isn't it?
okay.
I have my ARM template. If I just scroll down, this is what it's going to show us. These are all the parameters, aren't they? It's going to
If
ask the value for them. But
if you close this one, so
no,
it
it will
is
not. It will not show you any red asterisks. Even if you
here
don't pass it, it'll just fail.
deployment code. Here
It won't.
deployment code
Unless
asterisk.
you give
I'm sorry. One at a time, please.
unless
Hi.
you input you will not
hmm Yeah, unless you click on here, it won't show you what are the parameters that you're passing here.
But it is optional. Like if you see the template, there is a head asterisk, red asterisk. It means
hmm
that is mandatory. But
Correct.
here it is not mandatory. If we don't pass, what will happen?
It'll fail. Your templates are gonna
Oh,
fail. Your template
wait.
deployment is gonna fail. It's
Okay.
not mandatory. Reason being, parameters are not mandatory, aren't they? They are optional in nature. So,
But
go please.
but automatically it will fail because the parameters are not passed and a null will be passed into that parameters and
Exactly.
automatically.
Automatically, it's gonna fail. So if I just run this out, save this out the way it is, and just run this out, just gonna fail here, telling that the parameters are not available and all that stuff. So if I just run this out right now, and it'll now start failing, telling that what I don't understand what you're really trying to do because I haven't received any parameters out here. And if it hasn't received any parameter, as you said, there's a null value that's going to be passed to your template, and null value resources won't be created out here as such. So it'll just fail out there, telling that I'm sorry, I won't be able to create. So that's where you'll have to, let's say, pass in those parameters out here as such.
Okay. But it's optional.
Yes, it's optional. Parameters are always optional in Azure DevOps. So now it's telling yes, template deployment is trying to it's trying to start the template deployment, and it failed right now. It's telling very simple, telling that what the value for the parameter template plan name at line 1 is not provided. Please see so on and so forth for the details out here as such.
The error is straightforward.
Yes. Yes. Any more questions, guys? So this is the agenda for the next class. Is that today I just want to set out telling what all we are going to build and what all we are going to construct. In tomorrow's session, we would use these artifacts, go ahead, deploy a release, and understand the use and importance of a key vault on what exactly is an Azure, let's say, key vault, where exactly it comes into picture. And before I even do keywords, I will need to do these things out here. That's the reason I made sure to club 2 different classes out here. So there are 2 different classes that I clubbed today because the keyword concept wasn't covered for the earlier session. So I clubbed 2 different classes, and tomorrow we are going to look at what are keywords and understand the importance of a keyword in Azure and Azure DevOps out here as such. Any more
Okay.
questions, guys? Hmm? Anyone? Any more questions out here? All right. Thank you and have a good day ahead. And we'll meet tomorrow and we'll discuss more on this one. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.